Gostaspi, and welcome to the Katy podcast series. The mission of my podcast is for us to realize that we're all really great. We've got it going on, and that we can be even greater. And most importantly, how can we bring this greatness to the world through a brand, our brand? So why the Katy podcast? Well, as I always say, two reasons. One, I truly care about humanity deeply, and I want us all to see how great we really are, to be happier in our lives and in our careers. And second, because I'm just like you, I struggle just like you with those feelings of being less than and having high stress. And so some days are good, some days are bad, and I like to share and I like to learn what other people are doing. So today we're in for a special treat. I'm here with Richard Levick, Chairman and CEO of Levick, one of the world's leading crisis and litigation communication firms. And Richard and I have been friends for several years. And I am so excited to have you here. One, because we're friends, but two, because you're so wise and you've got such good opinions and you're hilarious. So welcome, Richard.
Well, thank you so much, Katy. Great to be on the show.
I appreciate it. So, Richard, let's start by having you tell us a little bit about your illustrious background and how you got to where you are. Because I think sometimes when we occupy such a place that you do and have run the business for as long as you have, people can't even fathom how we got to where we are. And I think that in and of itself is an education in terms of how brands develop.
Do you want me to include the prison years, or should I just sort of skip over that real quickly?
It's a really good question. Include it because, I always say authentic brands win. So we got to know the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Thank you. Right. So we'll start with the ugly. I think like a lot of people, there was this book years ago, What Color is Your Parachute? And, I don't know, it's been, 500 different editions, But I can't say that I remember a chapter or any wisdom in it, just that it was important because one of the things it's teaching us is about to be our authentic selves. And I think too often we think about our careers only in the professional sense, but as you know better than anyone, we professionally, and certainly personally as well, are the culmination of so many things, our childhood experiences, the artistic side of our brands, the intellectual side, how we view things, what we read. And one of the things that I really enjoy about crisis and litigation communications is there is no playbook for all those people who say, well, we need a crisis plan. I'm like, well, sure, that's great. But it's the first thing that's going to get burned in a fire or lost in a flood. It's ultimately about judgment. And in order to have great judgment at that moment, at at Enron or AIG or the Gulf oil spill or the Catholic Church, we have to have our client's perspective, the Buddhist perspective of seeing into their forehead and what they need to hear and understand first, what the stockholders and shareholders and stakeholders need to hear and feel. We need to have a sense of history, of business, of law. It's all of those things that come together, and then a little Nostradamus so that we can predict what's going to happen next and prepare our clients. And so I think it's all of those things together and why every day is so different and so challenging. And then, salt that over with the fact that you're working with countries and companies around the world, and you have to appreciate the different cultures and perspectives and sense of justice and sacrifice. So it's a terrific career as long as you like roller coasters.
So you said so much there I want to unpack. I want to get to the judgment piece in a minute. But before that, how did you ever decide that you wanted to be in this business? Can you capture it for me in a couple of sentences?
I think it sort of found me in third grade when, we were all lining up and saying, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a nurse, I want to be we didn't call them first responders then, a fireman or a police officer. I don't think when it got to me, I said, well, I'd really like to be in crisis litigation communications. I'm pretty sure I didn't say that. And what really drove me from childhood was, I can tell you where I was the moment, and earlier today I had the honor of speaking with Ambassador Andy Young, who is is a close confidant of Martin Luther King. And I can tell you where I was when I heard Martin Luther King on a news program. I was probably 6 years old, and listening to the newscasters talk, and somewhat, not overly critically, but somewhat critically from a white perspective of how they viewed Martin Luther King. There was some of that John Lewis troublemaker critique in there. And then a few years later, when he was assassinated as a young man, and I can tell you where I was, I can tell you Bobby Kennedy, and and on, and Ed Muskie when he was crying in the back of the truck, and of course the '68 election with Humphrey, all those moments. And what drove me was I wanted to be a protagonist to history, not a spectator. And so I saw politics as a higher calling, very moved by Bobby Kennedy. I mean, we'd learned things about Bobby that weren't all that charitable in the years to come, but certainly that 10-year-old's view of Bobby Kennedy and how we could make a difference. So the calling was to politics, and I got a graduate degree in that area. I would eventually get a law degree, but only when I started to realize that politics wasn't for the foremost calling for me, and yet I had devoted my education and most of my advanced degrees to that field. When I first started the firm nearly 25 years ago, I think the feeling was that we would be representing law firms on their brand. We've represented and worked with over 300 of the major law firms around the world. And that's, it was right at the right time. That's when we started Howry and Simon, Womble, Carlyle, Kilpatrick, Stockton, all of those early brand activities. And, and had done that with a predecessor firm before I started this one. But about 3 years into this firm, realized that the merger mania of law firms meant a couple of things. One, that you were going to have fewer firms to work with. I mean, if you're handling a merger and you're representing the British firm and the American firm, and the next day, they merge, it didn't take a mathematician to realize that having two clients in the morning and one in the afternoon probably wasn't the best formula for growth. And we started doing more and more crisis work. And when we handled the Catholic Church, that really put us on the map. When we handled the Gulf oil spill and Guantanamo Bay, right after 9/11, those seminal historical issues put us at the forefront. And it was clear that, that would be the work that we would do. And that's what we've been doing for over 2 decades. The Boko Haram kidnappings in Nigeria, the list just goes on and on.
Wow.
And you have the opportunity to be there and to be on an airplane at any moment and traveling around the world and meeting with heads of states and heads of corporations. And you realize what they say and do next matters, and what you say is going to decide what's going to happen.
So, tell me, you're saying you reinvented yourself so many times, it sounds like, and that's really something that I always want my audiences and listeners to learn from my guests. This capacity to shift. And I always say nimble brands win. Our own personal brands have to be nimble and flexible and really see the vision for what we want to do. So, with your degrees and with your law degree, you chose this route and you started your own firm. What made you pursue and keep going before you got all those illustrious clients? How did you keep going?
Well, I would say that the history is interesting, but the present to me is more fascinating because it's more challenging. And I may be getting ahead of ourselves, but I didn't start out when I first built the firm to be a crisis firm, to be one of the top crisis communications firms in the world. We started out to brand law firms because it wasn't that long after Bates v. Arizona, which is the late 70s, but it takes well over a decade before the big defense firms, law firms, start to get into law firm branding. But it was the rapid sense of the maturation of the market and the fact that managing partners were no longer participating in the brand activity, but in fact it was being delegated to this new role, first of marketing manager, marketing director, and then chief marketing officers, who are, They're hired for their creativity, but they're only empowered to cut budgets because they're not revenue makers directly, and so they tend to be defending themselves against partners who wonder why they're there. So it became increasingly challenging. And of course, as you know, lawyers operate by stare decisis, which, precedent. So that must be a great way to practice law. I guess that means it's also a great way to market. But marketing is all about being first, right? We have to change the mold, and those that come second usually are reserved for the dustbin of history. It's all about being first. So when we had to recognize the need to change the raison d'etre of the firm, not just to law firm marketing and branding, but to the communications, and to earn that trust. And as we started doing that, obviously we got more and more calls. And when my phone rings in the middle of the night, it's usually not Ed McMahon telling me I may have already won, but in fact, a potential client in crisis. Now, I will say that change is the constant. And I remember when we were switching years ago from doing primarily law firm work to doing the clients of the law firms, doing the crisis work. And most of the people in the firm were extremely reluctant to change. And every couple of years, we have to constantly evolve the brand. And here we are in the year 2020, and in just 2 quarters, we are experiencing 1918 with a pandemic, 1929 with the collapse of Wall Street,
yes,
and 1968 with the unrest and the first great civil rights movement post-Reconstruction. And it's as if we're having all those things at once. And the need for us to change is so significant at every level, at a personal level, internally, obviously, and so much about diversity and inclusion, but also at a brand level, because the internet, since Al Gore invented the internet, its speed has only accelerated. And we used to be able to get in front of it from a communications point of view, and yet you have to now be able to predict the future and tell your clients, look, once something happens here, you're not going to get in front of it. If you compare Johnson & Johnson's Tylenol, Jim Burke, nearly 40 years ago, we all think of him as the lodestar, as the icon of crisis, and he is. I mean, it's the Johnson & Johnson miracle of how they overcame the cyanide crisis is the thing that history is made of. However, he still, because of the FBI, he didn't respond for nearly a week, 4.5 days. If you look at the Gulf oil spill with BP, Tony Hayward responds instantly when he gets that call at 7:30 in the morning London time. He says 2 things, 3 if you count the expletive, but he says, we're going to be transparent and we're going to clean this up. And yet, name another company in the history of capitalism that paid in excess of $60 billion in fines and got no credit. The market has just changed, and that's a dozen years ago. Things move so quickly now that companies have to be anticipatory, not reactive, and that requires the crystal ball.
So that's a great point. How do you, and because, part of what I teach, and that's why you and I are friends, is great brands pivot and change. And so the change that I work on with lawyers' personal brands is sometimes, always actually, very challenging for them to be willing to let go of their old constructs and allow me to help them reframe things so that they can grow. Otherwise, the brand stagnates. How do you successfully counsel your clients to allow you to guide them through these stressful events and allow them to grow and change, I guess is what I'm saying. How do you do this? It sounds to me like a yeoman's task. What's involved, and how do you do it, and how do they allow you to do it?
Well, first, let me say that the constant change of ourselves is petrifying. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's recognizing the fear and marching forward.
Absolutely.
And right? And we have to read an immense amount, we have to observe an immense amount, we have to listen, and we have to see what's going around us and constantly change and evolve. And we're not always going to get it right, but do we have a sense of the direction of the arc of history? And it takes one of the reasons why I love writing. And every week we have this newsletter, this e-newsletter. It goes to about 25,000
Oh, it's
people.
a good one, folks. If you haven't read Richard's newsletter, I encourage you to subscribe. It's fascinating.
Thank you. And I spend every Sunday I'm writing that. Now we have ghost writers, and they've written. They've written so much for me over the years. But that newsletter, I write that every Sunday, and one of the reasons why it's a required discipline is it allows you to take all that unconscious time in swimming laps, going for a walk, in the shower, when your unconscious mind is starting to push things to the front of your mind so that you become conscious of it. It helps you start to itemize it, to start putting it in order, to start giving it some sense. It's a really helpful part of of our maturation that allows us to change. And I think the other thing that's so critically important about change is not without cost.
Yes.
Right. And so to your question about companies, you say, look, it's the old commercial, the muffler commercial, right? Do you want to pay me now or do you want to pay me later? If we do the right thing for AIG, if we don't pay the bonuses, yeah, there's legal liability, there's some brand, there's some market share liability, but you're not going to become the poster child for Wall Street. Well, they didn't have, and they had some great people there, but they didn't have the courage of their convictions because they were still looking in the rearview mirror for Sheikh Mohammed in the executive office in Dubai after 9/11. And they had all these billions of dollars of contracts for Dubai ports, but it was the willingness to sacrifice that in the short term because he knew and they knew that they wanted to become one of the leading financial centers in the Gulf. And if they made that multi-billion-dollar sacrifice, they would likely be well positioned to re-earn America's trust they had so deservedly earned, but were at risk of losing. But if they made that sacrifice, so change is not risk-free. And I think that when we read history or we watch movies, we look at heroes, those people who stand up to the moment and make those changes. And we think, well, of course they got the promotion. Of course they got the guy or the girl.
Yes.
Of course they got the great headlines. And it doesn't work that way. First, we have to pay the price. First, we have to be isolated. First, we have to see the share price drop. I remember one of the first major cyber matters, and we've handled hundreds, and this was with Heartland. And the CEO made sacrifices instantly, and their share price, which had dropped precipitously in the opening days of this new thing called hacking and cyber warfare, came back, and within the week was trading above the price that it had prior to the drop. And that was that the market recognized courage, it recognized leadership. And we're going into a boxing ring. We're going to take our hits, but the question is, what are the sacrifices we can make? What are the dues that we can pay that are short term and are lesser than, and are going to put us into a position for the future?
So you always have to be looking on the horizon to see what could shift, like you said at the very beginning, and how things could change. So it's extremely stressful. I mean, and in your world, we all know it to be extremely stressful. But talk to me about that stress. As my research shows, the stress goes up, self-confidence drops, and that impacts people's abilities to say the right thing, do the right thing, come across as confident brands that are effective. How do you deal with that day in and day out for yourself? And then how do you consult with your clients so that they show up well under the crisis strain?
Well, I don't know what you mean by stress. I mean, I slept beautifully through the Eisenhower administration. I don't think I have since, but I had no trouble at that point. So, look, you're an expert at this issue. One is the acceptance of it. We know that this is stressful, and half of what a
Yes.
client is paying for is the steady hand at the tiller, knowing that we're going to make it through the storm and having enough experience. Like you, I teach at different universities and law schools and whatnot. And I remember teaching undergraduates in crisis communications, and they always said, "Well, I want to get into the field. How can I be a superstar right away?" And I would think, it's really hard without life experiences to go in and then tell people, well, this is how it's going to turn out because I've lived through this before. You have to experience it. You have to be able to share other experiences for them, and so that they have confidence in your vision as well. Traveling around the world, it's understanding. When I'm in Korea, I'm a pretty good student of the jables of those Korean companies that were largely created after World War II, that are usually or historically family owned but publicly traded. Or when I'm in Dubai versus Abu Dhabi, I have an appreciation for the difference in the cultures, even though they're only 90 minutes apart. And on and on. We want to understand, we want to see the world through our clients' eyes. What's most important to them? A key question is, what is a win for you? From a communications point of view, what's the win? We need to understand that. I can remember, Katy, a number of years ago, we were dealing with a company that was in defense. They were, and this was during it was during one of the Gulf Wars, the Iraq War, and they had a billion-dollar plus contract with the Department of Defense, and like so many of these things, we get called in at the last minute, and it's Sunday night. 60 Minutes has already got the show that they're running, and they call us up and like, what can we do? And at that point, the best advice you can give is, well, turn the TV off. Actually, you better watch it to understand where they're going. But you're not going to change it now. But in that situation, it was so interesting. Their billion-dollar contract, and they were not, that was about 90% of the company. They were just $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, whatever it was. They were, a relatively small or mid-cap company that. Because they were also a very, very religious company. People may remember this. They were selling the scopes to the U.S. military at a time where President George W. Bush was taking great pains to say, this is not a religious war. This is not a war against Islam. But the scopes had codes in them that were coded for religious verse. So you can imagine we were giving these scopes, trading them, selling them to different armies that were largely Islamic in the Gulf. And here they were called the Jesus scopes. When we saved that contract, and it was, you had bipartisan opposition to the contract after the 60-minute show. When we saved it a week later, when we saved that contract, the CEO was grateful, but there were senior members of that company who were upset. Yes, we saved all those hundreds and hundreds of jobs and all that revenue, but they felt that they had betrayed their purpose, which was as a Christian company. And I'm sharing that not because there's a right or wrong answer, but because you have to understand what makes people tick. You have to understand what the situation is, what the win is. And I think it's critical, and the CEO understood that. As a very religious person, but he still understood that the company's survival was mission one. So communicating with your clients, listening, and I know this is something you and I have talked about at other times, exposing our own vulnerabilities.
Yes.
Right? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yes, I agree. Keep going. Yeah. Exposing your vulnerabilities. Yeah.
And it is, knowing thyself and being true to thine own self, but also listening really carefully with our emotional intelligence, with our intellectual intelligence, with our eyes, with our ears, watching their body language and saying, what's the most important thing that's going to resonate with them? We're all born to sell. We don't realize that. We unlearn how to sell. But think about it. When we're born naked and afraid and crying, we instantly know if we want warmth, if we want love, if we want food. All we need to do is cry. I mean, it's amazing, right? We don't have any money. We don't have any political power, but we control those two adults running around the room. It's
Yes,
amazing how we
true.
know how to sell. We know how to sell our needs. We unlearn that, and we need to relearn that kind of listening, that kind of connection, that kind of love, which says, our client comes first. We're going to do anything for them, but first we're going to get in their head and see the world from their perspective.
So that's so beautiful, so well said. Speaking to that love, would you say if you had to impart one thing that you want the listeners, however way they view crisis and litigation communication, so that they can do their part in maybe mitigating damage or being able to use their judgment well and see things more clearly, what would that be? How would you summarize that? Is that love element in communicating and the
I
caring
think
part?
I think so, and this goes for both sides of the equation. The lawyers who are talking to their clients, the communications experts who are talking to the clients, and the clients too. There are three great fears we all share in this world: death, change, and public speaking, and not necessarily in that order. I think people would rather be the one who's being eulogized than having to give the eulogy. We're so afraid of public speaking, and we're
True.
afraid of, when we're afraid of change. And one of the things that crisis tells us is whatever you've been doing isn't working anymore. We need to change. And if you look at crisis after crisis after crisis, fracking, Keystone, Gulf oil spill, AIG, if you look at all of it, what's happened is there's been change, and yet people refuse to recognize it. I know I've used the example of AIG a couple of times, but they still paid the bonuses. Why? Because they were looking in the rearview mirror.
Wow.
And fracking, when the movie Gasland came out, it changed everything. It was within months. It was controlling the internet search. That's remarkable at the time. An HBO movie controlling the search engine, first time that ever happened. It changed the dialogue. Yet the industry remained the same. Sugar was told they would be the next tobacco. That industry, the coal industry, and other high fructose sugar companies didn't change for a decade. Seeing what's in front of us is really, really challenging, and having the courage to change is critical. And it's really hard. And one of the reasons pre-pandemic we were on a plane all the time is one of the ways to earn that trust is you're with people wherever they are in the world, and you are ready to go into battle side by side with them.
When you show up with people, that's true. And so now the world is very different, but still that fear of change exists, and still people's fear of speaking and death exists. And so the study in this is really going back to love and actually, finding your voice and caring about people and doing the right thing for you, right? And people can sleep better at night once they say, I did the best I could today, and I'm proud of myself, and the consequences may not be exactly what I wanted, but I stuck to my core values and to who I am, and whatever you want to frame that love as, and I connected with another human being, and I did the right thing. Fair?
I think that's very right, and I would say not only that I did the best I could, but the statement you made at the end, I did the right thing, and that's really, really hard when there's an abeyance of courage, when we're not willing to lean into the crisis, or from that matter, change is never easier than it's going to be today when the Klieg lights aren't on. Because when the crisis starts, you get zero credit for making change. Then it's all expected.
Sure.
We have to do the right thing today. We have to do the right thing all the time. And Stephen Covey in his 7 Habits talked about abundance mentality versus scarcity mentality. Abundance mentality is a win-win, where scarcity mentality looks at the world as a win-lose. And tragically, right now, the country is going through a win-lose period. It's binary. Well, if you're doing well during the pandemic, if you're doing well during this financial crisis, if you're doing well when Donald Trump is president and I'm not, it's win-lose. I have immense faith in the human condition. I have immense faith in people of the globe and the American concept. We're the longest lived constitution in the world, severely tested right now, I might add. But I have great confidence in it. And we have to show that confidence in people. We have to believe and do the right thing now when no one's watching, because if you wait until someone is watching to do the right thing, it is de facto not authentic.
Yes, amen. Well said, my friend. Well said. And that's really so true, that this abundance mentality really does exist. And it's because it's about who we are deep down inside rather than what's going on around us. I find people feel so out of control these days, always, but the pandemic has brought it to the forefront. They think external circumstances dictate their inner peace and their ability to prosper. And I'm always working on that for myself. I so haven't perfected it, but I'm keenly self-aware of that it really starts with doing the right thing for how I choose to see the world. And that if somebody else has something, that does not mean that there's a lack for me. And that truly is an inspirational brand. And it's a brand that works, right? Because then everyone prospers. And whoever said that there's not enough for everyone? And that's really what I think everything boils down to with the crisis world, right? Because people are just coming from a very lack mentality and acting on it and not doing the right thing. And then brilliant people like you have to come and support them, which is good for business. Don't get me wrong. It's just, at what point do we as a society evolve and shift? So, Richard, I want to switch gears now and talk to you about part 2 of my podcast, which my listeners really enjoy, which is you bring something to the table that's been taking up your thinking time, and let's brainstorm through it. I can coach you through it, however way you want to look at it. And my audience learned so much from you being vulnerable and going through the process, and hopefully you'll get some takeaway too. So what's been taking up most of your thinking time these days?
Well, we did cover some of this in the first half, and I talked about the evolution of our brand, and that's been really important. You and I did one of my podcasts, and I touched on this a little bit, which is there were a couple of decades by the fact that we simply said we were a crisis and litigation communications firm that had us stand alone. So the evolution of our brand, that's something that's deeply personal, was really critical. And I know it's resonating now because, we talked about our weekly newsletter. I get more comments on that than I ever did with my weekly Forbes column, or, which reached ostensibly tens of thousands of people, and with Compro, which reached, again, tens of thousands, and all these other platforms, which are great platforms. But they were about, those articles were about things, about a crisis, about sometimes the tactical or strategic things to be doing, or world events. But the newsletter, although it is about world events, is deeply personal. So I think finding that has been really relieving, and being that vulnerable. And as Oscar Wilde says, and again, we talked about this great quote, but being yourself because all others are taken. It's so hugely important. I think it is. Thank you. And the other thing is, there's fear. I have to tell you, at the beginning of the pandemic, 5-6 months ago, about once a week, 2 days a week, there was this unsettled feeling, because suddenly we're all walking without a net. Does business just stop? Does the market crash? If I have clients, do they stop paying? And those things strike a fear at your very core that interrupt your sleep, or it's your first waking thought. It's that feeling of loss, and although a lot of that is dissipated over the last number of months, because we've seen we may be operating at 80% efficiency, 82% efficiency, whatever it is. Clients may be taking longer to pay, but they're paying. We'll continue to march forward. There's more confidence in the future. There is still that great fear. And the other thing, and I touched on this, is, I'm a former professor of the politics of constitutional law. Despite its flaws, its original sin, leaving women out of the Constitution, it is a rather remarkable document when you go back 249 years and you realize, this great experiment, people did not have self-rule. It's this extraordinary leap forward, and yet it is challenged right now. And Hamilton's Federalist 68, the concept that someone just expert in PR, what he called, quote unquote, the little arts back then, he thought could never become president. And I don't say this as a political statement. I say this as a constitutional one. I think that the fear, my late father, bless his heart, used to say when I was a kid and we would watch the inaugural, oh, this is the miracle of a peaceful transition. And I would look at him like, oh, Dad, come on. It's America, right? Of course it's going to be a peaceful transition. Do not take that for granted.
Oh, yeah, you're right about now. So let me ask you, how did you overcome that fear to write such a successful, vulnerable, personal blog, newsletter? How did you do it so we can learn?
Well, it is like deciding you want to run the marathon, right? You just start. And
where did you start, though? Really, for my audience, it's a really good question. And how did you push through? And what were the tools you used?
Well, first of all, you said in an earlier podcast when we were talking about diversity and inclusion, please don't anyone think of this as an initiative. And the same is true of our personal growth and change. There is no such word in personal change that ends with ED. We've not finished, we've not completed, right? Yes. It's all ING. We're all changing. So, and it is, the other thing is that, Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Great Panthers, the late Maggie Kuhn, used to say, and I'm sure she did not originate it yet, I had the honor of meeting her and after a great loss, and she mentioned it and it stuck with me. And that was, when one door closes, another opens. And when doors are shutting on us, it is a loss. It may be a tragedy, but it is the universe's unsubtle way, or maybe very subtle but brutal way, of saying we need to be looking at other doors. And the increased competition in the marketplace, the artificial intelligence and the internet, the speed at which things changed. You said, well, we've been changing and changing and changing, but what is our brand? What's our position? How do we stand? Who am I? Because if I had grown, gotten into my 60s 30 years ago, gray hair would have been enough to be the brand. Oh, he's been around. She's been around. Gray hair was enough. It's not anymore. And in fact, we are, as an American society, we look at seniority. Think of all the isms out there. And when I see, we talk about sexism and racism, I'm amazed at how many headlines are ageist and no one thinks about it. It's, YouTube boomer, right? Right?
Yep.
Okay, right? The dismissiveness of that. And there's so much other.
Yes, there's a lot of judgments in there, right?
Oh, there's there's so much judgment in there, and I think that there is no substitute for wisdom or experience, and it is learning to be at peace with who we are, and as you say, being really proud. I'm 62. I'm not about to lie about my age. It is. This is what we bring, and I think that there's extraordinary value, and we have to see that. We have to be aware of it, and I'm constantly reading and quoting different religious texts, Buddhist and Jewish and Christian and non-denominational. And in the Talmud it says that we are going to fall down 7 times and we have to get up 7 times. Our goal is to constantly get up. Life is going to keep beating us down, and we have to keep getting up. And the difference between and this is from Hallmark, but the difference between a loser and a winner is that a winner is the one who got up one more time.
Yes, absolutely. And just that resolve is what I often tell my clients. That ability to have, it's the F word, it's the other F word, faith. Faith is not religious. Faith is about the resolve to say, hey, I'm worth it. I have purpose. I do something in this world that matters, regardless of what's going on around me. And I think that's the beautiful thing that you did with your newsletter evolving, the vulnerability you brought to it, and you evolving is that you stop and think, okay, it's scary for all of us walking without a net, like you said, but I'm going to take these steps because I'm going to go inside and realize that things are changing whether I want them or not, and I'm used to a certain way, but it's happening, and so I'm going to be part of it. I'm going to control it rather than be a victim of it, and that requires vulnerability. And I think there's nothing more attractive than a successful person. But mostly I'm gonna go gender bias here and say men, because men are not taught to be vulnerable like that, because it's poo-pooed on, frowned upon. But strength comes from that resolve of just stepping back and saying, I'm gonna do this because it's the right thing to do, back to what you said. So last thing, Richard, what's next for Richard Levick?
Well, first, I just want to compliment you. You talked about faith. Faith is what we do without proof.
Yes, Martin Luther King's, he said it a different way, taking that first step without seeing the rest of the stairwell, right? I always think of him. Well said, yes.
So, what's next is the continued evolution. I was being interviewed by, I think it was Bloomberg a few weeks ago, and they were saying, well, what is it like doing new business development during a pandemic? And I said, it's like dating in high school. Everyone said, you're the one, but can we wait a couple months before I make up my mind? And that's what business development is like right now, because how many times have you met with someone and they said, you're it, but we're not spending any money until we see sort of where the edge of this pandemic, and so we'll hire you then. So, but what has come in its place has been other business, a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion business, a lot of on the healthcare side with the pandemic. And there again, when the universe conspires to take something away, there's another path there. You have to constantly be looking. And the other thing is we have to find the blessing in our challenges, and right, to continue to have faith. And you and I were talking pre-show a little bit, but denial, we are all experts at denial. We are born into this world knowing we're all going to die, but we do a great job convincing ourselves we are immortal.
Amen.
And we're not going to age, and we're not going to, all these other bad things are going to happen to somebody else. We're great at denial. Well, denial has real value because it keeps you focused on what matters. And if the Hindus are right and we're eventually going to come back at cows, there's a whole lot of lessons I need to learn before I get to that enlightened state. And every day is a struggle to make change and show leadership with peace and understanding. And sometimes I do it really well, and other days I feel like I've got to start all over.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's a work in progress. I always say, people talk about perfectionism in my world and balance. And I don't like the word balance because it feels like I'm walking a tightrope and I might fall off, and that increases my stress and reduces my brand value. So I always look for harmony. Harmony is an ebb and a flow. And as long as you get up every day and do your best to do the right thing, then there is going to be the highs and the lows, but I think in the real world, that's exactly how it works. There's shifts, there's elemental changes, back to that word, and it's supposed to be that way. And that's accepting the harmony of life. And that does include death, frankly, right? You come and you go, and there's just no way to avoid that. But yes, that term denial, you've reframed it for me, so I appreciate it. And I love the fact that you do research so many different religions. You should research mine and see what you find around mine. You didn't mention it. I don't know if you know Zoroastrianism, but check into that and see what you find.
Well, that's going to be our next show because, of course, we're going to devote a whole hour to that. And
There
you're
you
going
go, the religious podcast, the one I never wanted to have and never tried to have, staying away from those topics. But really, religion and politics from an educational, like you said, constitutional law from that vantage point is interesting. People learn rather than polarizing and up for debate and people hating, right? So I value how you research it and use it to your benefit. I think that's very smart. So
Well,
thank
thank
you
you.
for being a guest, Richard. I love talking to you always and learning from you. Your smarts, your wit, your fun, and just your opinions and your knowledge in this space are tremendous. And if people want to find you, where can they find you? Where
Well,
should we send them to?
they go to levick.com, levick.com, and the newsletter, the ebooks. We just put one out on DEI. We've got ebooks on litigation communications, our hardback books, all our different podcasts and shows. I host these different programs for different general counsel publications in this country, through Asia and the Middle East, and on and on. So levick.com. And in closing, let me just say, Katy, thank you so much. And at the moment you mentioned harmony, I just want you to know a hummingbird came to my window, looked in, and said, "Can I be the next guest?" So your harmony is really wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Richard. It's been an honor to have you. I hope my listeners benefited, and please share this content if you think somebody else would benefit from learning from Richard and myself. And until next time, Katy out.